So, as promised, a quick lecture on survey research because it's a descriptive type of study, but it's a little more in depth and it's so common it sort of needs its own coverage. This is week 2, lecture 3. So, survey research again is analyzing data that you collect through self-report. So, those self-reports could be surveys or they could be interviews, but people provide information about themselves to you. And most correlational research is self-report, um, and a lot of dissertations are correlational, but there are definitely problems with collecting data through surveys, which is why there's a whole lecture. So what are those problems? Well, one of the big ones, there's actually a lot, are what we call response sets. So response sets are when your participants, your respondents, do not respond truthfully. Instead, they use some sort of rule for their responses rather than just being honest. So when people complete the survey or questionnaires, you want them on your dissertation to be honest, not use one of these response sets. So, for example, let's say you're doing a study where you're asking folks to report their incidents of unsafe sexual practices or drug use. Folks are probably going to lie, if anything. They're probably going to underestimate those things, right? Unless they feel very, very safe or it's anonymous. So when people use response sets, instead of just answering truthfully to what you're asking them, it lowers or it can even destroy the validity. That is the accuracy of what you're trying to collect if they're lying so much or giving you such garbage data. So we want them to be honest, not used to response sets. So here are some response sets. There's the acquiescent response set, and this is the one where folks just tend to be agreeable. They tend to say yes or true to things rather than actually giving an honest response. We call that acquiescent. The opposite of that is like grumpy cat, where they're just like no or false to everything. They're just, a downer on everything. We call that naysaying. One of the big problems is what we call social desirability. It's one of the big response sets. And this is when folks, again, they don't answer honestly. They answer in ways that tend to make themselves look better. So ways that are socially acceptable. It's also called faking good. So the opposite also happens where people just, they want to screw up your findings. So they answer in ways that make themselves look bad. We call that faking bad. Which is the opposite of social desirability. They're trying to look bad for whatever reason. Then there's folks, and I've actually kind of done this. They just pick one of the extreme alternatives. Everything's either never on one end or everything strongly agree on the other, that sort of thing. And I've been in those sorts of moods where I just don't care. So I just go, yeah, super, everything was great. Just let me, go. The flip side of that is just going down the middle, and we call that cop-out. So cop-out is just the don't know 3 in the middle of 1 to 5 thing. We call that cop-out. Again, the point is we want them to be honest, not just go down the middle because they want to leave or whatever it happens to be. There's also inconsistent response set. In the inconsistent response set, people are just giving nonsense or obviously unthoughtful answers. So the same item, a couple apart from each other on your questionnaire, they answer completely differently, which tells you they're using an inconsistent response set instead of answering honestly again. And there's just straight up fabrication where they just make up crap. So they don't really know about the topic, so they make up opinions, say about something they don't really know about. So an example is the hospital survey called HCAHPS. HCAHPS is a survey that's done of all hospitals in the United States, random sample. And I think people basically respond using something called the halo effect to this. So the halo effect is when folks get sort of a general opinion about things and they use that to interpret sort of everything else. They use that general impression to interpret everything else. So the HCAP survey covers these different topics: clean environment, how good did the doctor and nurse communicate, how helpfully was the time, how well did they get instructions when they were discharged, how quiet was it, etc. And this is what the distributions of scores look like, and they really fall into 4 clusters. So the hospitals that are in cluster 1, that is the green one, note that it's high on everything, and those that are in 4, the purple one, they're low on everything. So there's never a case where someone, for example, said it was really clean, even though it wasn't. It was noisy and the medicines weren't explained well. There's sort of uniformity in opinion across completely different measures. Like even the food is in here, so it's always like you got good food and everything else was fantastic too. So anonymous data collection is one way to avoid response sets. So anonymous data collection is when the responses cannot, like period, be linked to the respondent themselves. So when people, this makes people feel safe when you have anonymous data collection, and so they're more likely to be honest, especially when you're asking sensitive information about sensitive topics. Another way you can test for response sets is to use something called lie scales, and these are questions that are built to detect response sets and other sorts of dishonest responses. So, for example, you can catch social desirability with questions that like almost no one answers affirmatively that tell you they're trying to look good. So, for example, very few people could answer both of these as like strongly agree and not be, lying. That is using a social desirability response set to look good. I've never told a lie in my life. Like, how many people could actually agree to that? And then you get somebody else who says, I'm great at everything I do. These could be used as lie scales, because if someone answers to both those, yes, totally, they're probably trying to fake looking good, fake good, or social desirability. You can do fake and bad catching in the same way. Have things like very few people can agree with both of the following. I've never accomplished anything of value in my entire life. Okay, well, like maybe someone agrees with that, but also I cannot remember any time I was ever happy. These are like really extreme things, so if people answer strongly to both of these in agreement, it probably suggests they're just trying to fake bad. So these are just examples of some of the lie scales. Like the MMPI has some like crazy number, like 7 or 8 lie scales on there trying to catch different response sets. So negative wording or reverse coding is something you're going to run into on questions. So some questions are worded, most questions are worded so that higher values indicate more of the thing that you're measuring, the underlying construct. But you notice some questionnaires, even though most of the questions are higher means more of the thing you're measuring, some are the opposite. And again, so higher means less of the thing. So we use these negatively worded questions again to catch people who are just being inconsistent, giving BS answers to things, or using extremes. So you can have, for example, questions that contradict each other, so that someone who says yes to both or no to both or rate both highly, they're clearly not responding honestly. They're just giving you garbage data. So, for example, here's some that contradict each other. I feel that my social group is respected by others. So that would be positively wording for respect of the social group. The opposite is my social group is shunned. So if someone's strongly agreeing with both of these, it tells you their data are probably garbage, right? Another example, I'm a really good person, I'm a horrible person. If they're agreeing strongly with both these, they're probably just giving you garbage data using extremes, right? So when scoring most questionnaires, like self-esteem ones or anxiety or whatever it be, you want a higher score to indicate more of the construct. So this is like a mistake people make on their dissertations where they'll have like an anxiety questionnaire, but a higher score means less anxiety, and it's just like mind-boggling to your committee. Don't do that. Whatever questionnaires you use for your dissertation, make sure that, or simplify your life anyway, by making sure that higher score means more of the thing you're measuring, because otherwise everyone just gets confused. And there are questionnaires out there where a higher value actually means less attachment, like that kind of thing. It's just nuts. Why do we do that? So the response rate is another issue with survey research. Response rate is something you have to report in your dissertation write-up, and it's just the percentage of surveys, interviews, or questionnaires that are successfully completed. So to calculate a percentage, you have to know how many were sent out and how many were completed, right? So if you send out 100 surveys and you get 30 back, that's 30 divided by 100 times 100 to get a percent. You get a 30. That is a 30% response rate, and you got to report it in your methods section of your APA write-up. So there are some guidelines for response rates, sort of what's considered minimally good enough to trust the underlying data that you collected. And oh God, yeah, that's right. So less than 50% is inadequate. You need at least 50% of them back completed. This is the graph here is the response rates for that hospital survey, and you can see the typical score, the center of that distribution is 25. Is that what it says? 25.24. It is definitely not 50%. So not only do they appear to use a response set of the halo effect with that hospital survey, it's also got a really low response rate. Like some of them are teeny tiny, 10%, etc. So the minimal response rate that is considered adequate for using your dissertation data or your survey data is 50%. You need at least 50% back. 60% is good. Greater, 70% or greater, wow, like you got a great response rate. So you do have to report this. And again, you need at least 50%. So how do you calculate response rates to online surveys? Like if you use SurveyMonkey, it actually is a real problem because you share a link and you don't necessarily know how many people got the link. So make sure you figure out a way, if you use SurveyMonkey or something similar to distribute your dissertation questionnaires, that you have a way to know how many people did it go to, so you can actually have that denominator to calculate your response rate. So low response rates are a problem. So they suggest that your sample is not really all that representative of all people, right? So if you send out 100 and you get 17 back, like this hospital survey, I mean, those 17 really reflect the whole range of opinions about hospitals? Probably not. There's probably a difference between those who responded and those who did not. Who's more likely to respond? People with extreme attitudes. So I think that's what we see in these hospital surveys, where people who, grandma survived at the hospital, they are more likely to respond, and they're more likely to say everything was fantastic due to the halo effect. And people who had a bad clinical outcome, for example, are probably more likely to respond as well and just trash everything. So how about those customer satisfaction cards at restaurants? Like, who completes those? You ever think about that? Well, it's the people who were really angry or really happy. That's who completes it. It misses the whole middle of the distribution, so you still get useful information from them, but really the responses are extremes. They're people who, got a hookup for free food or whatever, drinks, or people who they thought the service was really bad or their food sucked or whatever, and they just trash it. So if you're doing a history a sexual history survey for people, it's more likely that those with an interesting history would be less likely to respond, right? Unless you were able to let them feel like the data were anonymous or have anonymity in your data collection or ensure confidentiality. So how do we deal with these low response rates? Luckily, there's sort of a plan here if your response rates are kind of crappy. You can do, first of all, what's called second wave. And a second wave contact is where you follow up with those people who didn't respond to the initial time you sent out the survey. So you follow up with your non-responders. We call that a second wave of contact. So if you're doing a survey, for example, of sex offender counselors, and you send a survey to everyone in the country, you need at least 50% back for you to trust your sample, right? That's the minimum rule. So you could send non-respondents a second wave survey. So graphically, the responses to second waves actually sort of counterintuitively tend to be higher for whatever reason. So there's a distribution over there. Finally, if they don't respond to the second wave, you still don't get that 50% you need, you could try to call them up. Or I've seen cases where they send them sort of an abbreviated version, so they just get the most important measures. And then as a last resort, you could actually try to get people in person. Okay, so I guess email, sending them an email, personalized email would be somewhere in here too. So that's how you make sure you get that 50% minimum you need. So there are some advantages and disadvantages of written surveys versus in-person interviews and vice versa. So what's an interview? Briefly, it's just when someone actually asks the questions instead of just having them answer a paper or something online. Someone actually asks those questions on the phone or in person. So what's good about interviews is they can probe for details. So they can follow up and say, so what did you mean by that? So that's one good thing about doing interviews versus just paper surveys or online surveys. The response rates tend to be through the roof to interviews, like 80 to 90% of people respond, which is very nice compared to surveys. You can use them with folks who aren't very good at reading. They tend to have fewer missing items, so people not only are more likely to respond, they're more likely to respond to everything. And another benefit is the person can actually explain questions, the interviewer. So if the person says, what does that mean? You know, there's some interactive ability with interviews that you don't have with surveys. So what's not good about surveys, or excuse me, interviews versus surveys? Number one, they cost a lot of money. So time is money. They also take a lot of time. You have to train interviewers, so if there's more than one, you have to make sure, again, you have inter-rater reliability, that they're asking things the same and coding things the same. And it takes a heck of a lot longer, so I don't actually recommend these for your dissertation. That's why so many people end up doing online or paper surveys. So continuing, surveys are paper online questionnaires in which participants self-report their information to you. So what's good about surveys versus, say, doing interviews? Well, you can get really big samples, basically free. You just send out an internet link to SurveyMonkey and you can get huge samples with tiny cost and very fast. So you can get wide variation all over the place. You don't have to interview people in person. So it's really quick and easy to get your data. You don't have to train people. So what's bad about them? Well, number one is if you didn't ask it, you don't get an answer. So you can only obtain responses to explicit questions. There's no following up or probing if they don't understand something. The really big one is response sets. So again, people are more likely to use response sets when they respond to written things than if it's an interview, particularly if you give them like a huge packet. So one of the rules is don't ask things you're not going to use, because you shouldn't waste people's time, because you deteriorate the overall quality of your data if you just put them through the ringer the committees are really bad for this. They add lots of stuff to your dissertation. You should also ask this sort of thing. They're trying to be helpful, but it is important to find a balance that you just ask the stuff you need and not much more, right? So they also are subject to differences due to reading ability, because people are reading. And just overall, people take written surveys less seriously than a face-to-face interview or a phone interview. And so finally, the response rates tend to be a heck of a lot lower in interviews. So it's actually hard to get 50% response rate to a written or even a computer-based survey these days.